One broken man fell from the sky that night, but it was the dog who found him first. A blizzard howled through the mountains, and while the town slept, one retired K9 stood at the edge of the storm, ears pricked, eyes sharp. Somewhere out there a plane had fallen. Somewhere out there someone was dying. No one else saw the flicker of fire through the trees. No one else braved the cold. But he did. And what he led her to changed everything. A wounded pilot. A haunted past. And a girl with a dream too big for the sky. This is the story of how a loyal dog, a lonely officer, and a fallen stranger found something none of them were looking for: a home. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tap the bell so you won't miss the stories that will break and heal your heart all in one breath. The snow in Whispering Pines fell differently. It wasn't just cold, it was quiet. Heavy, like the weight of a memory. Nestled high in the northern ranges of Montana, the town was a breath of pine and frost, where the mountains seemed to keep secrets and the trees whispered them when no one was listening. That night, a storm had come, howling down the slopes like a wounded animal, tearing through the town with gusts that rattled shutters and buried silence beneath layers of wind and white. The streets were deserted. Lights flickered in distant windows, but no one dared step outside. No one except Officer Grace Morgan and the dog that never left her side. Grace was 32, tall and lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a quietness that came not from shyness, but from the discipline of someone who had learned early on that words couldn't fix everything. She wore her Snowpine County Patrol uniform like a second skin navy parka dusted with frost, utility belt snug at her waist, and a scarf tucked under the collar that was softer and older than the rest of her gear. The scarf was gray wool, worn at the edges, fraying slightly. It had belonged to her younger brother, Daniel, who had died in a cabin fire trying to save a boy trapped inside. Grace carried it with her in every snowstorm like a vow she could never quite speak aloud. Her grief didn't shout. It stood still beside her like a shadow. Speaking of shadows, Shadow was exactly that. A 7-year-old German shepherd with deep, intelligent amber eyes and a coat black as midnight with streaks of rust down his sides. He was tall for his breed, powerful in the way retired K9s often were, muscle beneath discipline, loyalty forged in training. Shadow had served 3 years on narcotics detection before a torn tendon ended his official career. Grace adopted him after losing her brother, and since then, the two had become inseparable, both scarred, both silent, both still searching. That night, Grace was on storm patrol. She steered the snow-covered SUV down County Route 12, the defroster hissing, the headlights barely piercing the flurries. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, upright, ears twitching at every branch snapping in the wind. Grace sipped lukewarm coffee from a metal thermos and scanned the roadside, watching for downed trees or stalled vehicles. Radio silence had become the norm in such storms, and though her breath fogged the cabin, her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought of Daniel, of the scarf under her collar, of the boy he'd saved who now sent her Christmas cards every year with shaky handwriting and drawings of fire trucks. Then it happened. A sound distant but sharp echoed across the trees. Not thunder, not wind. Something heavier, metallic, followed by silence so abrupt it felt like the mountains themselves had stopped breathing. Grace's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You heard that, boy." Shadow's head tilted. Then, without waiting, he barked once and pawed the door. She pulled over. The engine hummed as she threw on her headlamp and stepped out, boots crunching into snow nearly a foot deep. Shadow leapt down beside her, nose to the air, body tense. She didn't need words. He already had a direction. North. The trail was slow and brutal. Snow bit at her legs. Wind tried to steal her breath, and the trees seemed to close around them like watching sentinels. But Shadow moved with purpose, tail low, sniffing, turning, pausing, then darting ahead again. Grace followed, heart pounding. It wasn't just a hunch, it was instinct. Something had gone wrong. A mile in, the scent of burning metal slid under the wind like a ghost. Then, between a copse of broken pines, she saw it. A smear of orange against white. smoke curling against the black sky. Crumpled metal. A downed plane. Grace's breath caught. It was a small private aircraft, wing sheared clean off, the fuselage half buried in snow and splintered earth. The nose was crushed, the propeller bent backward, and one side of the cockpit was cracked open like a broken jaw. Shadow reached it first. He barked once, loud, sharp, and leapt toward the door. Grace sprinted behind him, heart hammering, the cold forgotten. Inside, slumped over the controls, was a man. Late 30s, broad shoulders. Flight jacket soaked in snow and streaked with blood. A gash split his forehead just above the brow, trickling red down a stubbled cheek. His hair was dark, cropped military short, and though his face was slack with unconsciousness, there was a tightness to his features, like he had fought something and lost. "Sir," Grace shouted, climbing onto the fuselage. She yanked the door fully open, ignoring the scream in her shoulder. Shadow barked again, urgent. No response. Grace leaned in, pressed 2 fingers to the side of the man's neck. A pulse slow, but there. "All right, big guy," she muttered. "Let's get him out." The extraction was messy. She had to cut the seatbelt with her rescue knife and brace the man's body against hers as she dragged him from the wreckage. Shadow stayed close, tail whipping snow as he circled and barked, ever the protector. Grace grunted under the pilot's weight. He was taller than she expected, heavier too, and finally lowered him onto the snow. "Logan," he mumbled as his eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat. "Where?" "You're safe," she said. "You're in Whispering Pines. Just hold on." But he was already slipping back into unconsciousness. With shaking hands, she triggered her emergency beacon, then reached into her coat and touched Daniel's scarf at her collar. She didn't know who this man was or why fate had hurled him into her path, but something told her this wasn't the end of a crash. It was the beginning of something else. She looked down at Shadow, who stood sentinel beside the injured stranger. "We found him," she whispered, and for the first time that night, Grace Morgan felt the stillness of the storm shift into something new. The wind had lessened by morning, but the cold remained cruel and stubborn, gnawing at the windows like a restless ghost. Whispering Pines lay buried under a thick white blanket, the roads invisible beneath drifts, and even the pines seemed to huddle closer against the cold. Inside the small log cabin behind the station house half-shelter, half-home warmth glowed in quiet pockets. The soft crackle of a wood-burning stove, the steam rising from mugs of black coffee, the gentle hum of an old radio lost between country stations. Grace Morgan had been awake for hours. She had called in the emergency last night, but the storm had closed the mountain pass, and no medical crew could reach them until midday at the earliest. So she had taken matters into her own hands, using every ounce of her first aid training to clean and stitch the wound above the pilot's brow, wrap his bruised ribs, and keep him from freezing. He was stable now, breathing evenly under layers of quilts on her worn leather couch. Shadow lay curled nearby, his head resting over his paws, one eye half open. The man had given a name before fading again, Logan, nothing more. Grace stood by the window, arms crossed over her patrol flannel, hair pulled back into a loose braid. She looked tired but alert. Her brown eyes, flecked with green, didn't stray from Logan for long. She wasn't a woman who trusted easily, especially not strangers falling from the sky with blood on their faces and secrets behind their eyes. Shadow gave a low rumble and rose. Grace turned. Logan was stirring. The man blinked against the soft light, his expression disoriented, body slow to catch up with awareness. His jaw tightened as pain reminded him he was very much alive. "Where?" His voice cracked. "You're in Whispering Pines," Grace said, her tone calm but clipped. "I found you after your crash. You were unconscious. It's been about 8 hours." He sat up slightly, wincing, a hand going to his ribs. "The plane. Scrap metal now. You're lucky to be breathing." Shadow padded over and stood just a foot away, tail stiff, ears alert. He didn't growl, just watched. Logan looked at the dog, then back at Grace. And, "You are?" "Officer Grace Morgan. This is Shadow." She motioned to the dog. "He's not used to company." Logan studied her for a moment. "You live here?" "I do, behind the station house. Quieter than town." He gave a slow nod and lowered his gaze, saying nothing else. Grace recognized the look. Not fear, not confusion, just hesitation. This was a man used to hiding something. "Do you remember what caused the crash?" she asked. There was a pause too long to ignore. "Mechanical failure, maybe?" "I don't know. Everything happened fast." She didn't believe him, not entirely. But she also didn't push. Not yet. She poured a second mug of coffee and placed it on the table beside him. "When you're strong enough, I'll call for a ride out. Roads are still iced over. You'll have to stay put." Logan nodded again. "Thanks for pulling me out." Grace said nothing. She simply turned back toward the stove, where a kettle was starting to rattle. Around mid-morning, a knock came at the side door, a single sharp rap followed by two slower ones. Shadow barked once, tail wagging. Grace opened the door to reveal a bundled figure stepping in from the cold, stamping slush from worn boots. Dr. Bill Carter was in his late 60s, tall and wiry with sun-weathered skin and a white beard that reminded people of a Western Santa Claus. He smelled faintly of tobacco and cedarwood, and his brown overcoat bore the stitched patch of Whispering Pines Animal Rescue. A vet of over 30 years, Bill had known Grace since she was a teenager chasing strays through the woods. He was one of the few people she allowed into her world without armor. "Snow let up just enough," he grunted. "Figured I'd check that leg I heard about." Grace gave a nod. "Back paw. Might have pulled something last night." As he knelt beside Shadow, murmuring to the dog in that low, comforting tone only animals truly trusted, his gaze flicked toward Logan on the couch. "Your guest?" he asked quietly. "Plane crash." "North Ridge," she said, keeping her voice even. Bill's brows lifted slightly. "Saw a report like that. 6 years ago. Military pilot bailed a burning jet, walked away with medals and a lawsuit. Was all over the news. Name was Pierce. Logan Pierce, I think." Logan's body stiffened ever so slightly on the couch. Grace looked back at him. "That ring a bell?" Logan didn't answer directly. "That man made mistakes. Paid for them." Bill raised both hands slightly. "None of my business. Just a familiar name." He turned back to Shadow, gently flexing the leg. "Nothing's broken. Just a twist. He probably strained it in the run. Some rest, some ice. He's a tough old boy." Shadow gave a soft grunt, nuzzling into Bill's hand as if in agreement. With that, the vet stood, gave Grace a nod, and disappeared back into the snow without fanfare. Logan sipped his coffee slowly. "He's got a good eye. He's known Shadow longer than I have." The silence stretched, neither of them entirely sure what came next. Finally, Grace took a folded blanket from the nearby chair and draped it over the arm of the couch. "You can stay until the road's clear," she said simply. "But if you're hiding from something, I need to know." Logan looked at her, eyes unreadable. "I'm not hiding. I just didn't think I'd survive the fall." Shadow, now lying near Logan's feet, lifted his head and gave a low exhale. Not a growl, but something softer. The sound of acceptance. Grace noticed. "Looks like you passed your first test," she said, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. And for the first time since the storm began, warmth returned to the cabin that had little to do with fire. The storm had begun to lose its bite, but the chill lingered like breath on a mirror. Outside, the trees of Whispering Pines stood solemn beneath a dusting of fresh snow, their branches bent under the weight of the night's grief. The sun, faint and filtered through a gauze of clouds, offered little warmth, but inside the log cabin behind the station, the air was different, gentler, expectant. Logan sat at the edge of the couch, still wrapped in the thick quilt Grace had given him, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee. His wounds ached, but the pain was familiar, reassuring in its own way. It reminded him he was still alive. Across the room, Grace moved with unhurried purpose, loading wood into the stove. She hadn't pried again, not directly, but the silence between them had grown heavier, filled with questions neither had asked yet. Shadow lay by the door of Logan's room, his head resting atop his front paws like a soldier on post. His eyes followed Logan's every movement, not with suspicion anymore, but with the same kind of quiet watchfulness reserved for someone who might be important. Logan cleared his throat, voice rough from disuse. "You ever lose someone in the line?" Grace paused, then straightened slowly. "Yes." He nodded once as if that answer held all the weight he expected. "I was a captain. Air Force, Special Operations." Grace leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely. She didn't speak, just let the silence open space for the rest. Logan stared into his mug. 2 years ago, during a high-altitude training exercise, weather shifted faster than forecast. We were doing maneuvers over Utah Canyon country. My co-pilot was a kid 24. Smart, too eager. His controls locked. I tried to override, but we hit the side of a cliff at 600 knots. He looked up, not at Grace, but through her into something far away. They found me 30 feet from the wreckage. I'd ejected a second too late. Shattered my shoulder, broke 3 ribs. He didn't make it. His name was Trent. Grace said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice quieter than her usual even tone, "I was a wildfire responder before the badge. 4 years ago, I got trapped during an evacuation cabin collapse. A teenager was inside. I was too slow. I came out with burns and a medal. The boy didn't come out at all." Logan's fingers tightened around the mug. "And your brother?" he asked gently. She blinked, caught off guard. "The scarf," he added, nodding toward her collar. "You look at it like it breathes." Grace's jaw tightened, but her voice didn't waver. "Daniel. Volunteer EMT. Pulled 3 kids from a structure fire. Went back in for the last one. The roof collapsed." Logan gave a slight nod. "Hero. He was just doing what felt right," she said. The two fell quiet again, the weight of their shared wounds settling like snow. A knock came at the side door, light and rhythmic, 2 short taps, then one longer. Shadow stood instantly, trotted to the door, and let out a soft huff. Grace opened it, revealing a small figure wrapped in a puffy red coat, knit hat askew over brown curls. Ellie, age 9, stood beaming, holding a small tin wrapped in a blue checkered cloth. "Hi, Officer Morgan," she chirped. "Mom said I could bring you the cinnamon rolls. They're extra warm." Ellie Reed was the kind of child who carried more in her eyes than most adults could bear. She had her father's green eyes and his quiet nature, Sergeant Will Reed, who had served 3 tours before coming home and losing a different kind of war to illness. Ellie had learned to speak softly, to listen more than talk, and to be brave in small, relentless ways. Grace smiled and crouched slightly. "Hey there, Ellie. Thank you. These'll help fight off the cold." Ellie stepped inside without waiting for an invite. She usually did, and her eyes quickly found Logan, who offered a faint, surprised smile. "That your visitor?" she whispered. "That's Logan. He had an accident." Ellie marched over, hand outstretched. "Hi, I'm Ellie. I know how to make cookies and identify elk tracks. Shadow's my best friend." Logan blinked, then shook her hand. "Hi, Ellie. You seem unstoppable." She grinned proudly. "That's what Miss Grace says, too." Grace gave a mock sigh. "And she's right more often than I admit." Ellie dropped to her knees beside Shadow and started scratching behind his ears like an expert. "He likes his belly scratched when it's cold," she said sagely. Logan watched the girl for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. Grace noticed the softness in his gaze, the way his fingers relaxed around the mug. Later, when Ellie had gone, leaving crumbs and laughter in her wake, Logan spoke again. "She reminds me of someone." Grace looked up. "My niece," he added. "Haven't seen her since before the incident." "You close?" "Was," he said. "My sister cut contact when the media storm hit." "Too much heat." Grace didn't press, just nodded. Shadow shifted and curled again by Logan's door as the light outside dimmed into winter's blue-gray dusk. Grace lit the lamp over the dining table. Logan had taken to sitting there more often, his shoulders straighter, his voice stronger. She still didn't know the full truth of his story, but she knew pain when she saw it, and she knew the courage it took to let pain be seen. That night, as the wind moaned low through the trees, Shadow lay like a sentinel before Logan's door, not to guard against danger, but to watch over a man who had fallen far and might just be learning to rise again. The morning arrived in silence, the kind of silence that comes after a long night of whispered snowfall. Outside the cabin, the world was wrapped in white again. No wind, no birdsong, only the muffled hush of fresh powder blanketing the pine forest. The sun broke weakly through the cloud cover, casting a bluish haze over whispering pines. And yet, for all the calm, Logan Pierce couldn't shake the uneasy pull in his chest like a string had been tugged somewhere far beneath the snow. Shadow had been restless since dawn, pacing the wooden floor of the cabin, glancing between the front door and Logan with the weighty eyes of someone who knew something needed to be found. When Grace stepped outside to check road conditions, the dog approached Logan, nudged his knee with a cold nose, and then padded to the door again, waiting, expectant. Logan, still recovering but stronger now, slipped into his borrowed coat and boots. His shoulder protested, but the pain was duller now, the kind he'd grown used to over years of injury and grit. Shadow barked once low and sharp, then darted ahead as soon as the door creaked open. Grace saw them go but didn't stop them. Instead, she watched from the porch with her arms crossed, lips pressed in thought. She trusted Shadow. And something in Logan's face had changed. Like a curtain had lifted, and behind it a pilot had remembered he still had wings. They crossed the edge of the property and entered the forest, snow crunching beneath boots and paws. The path was not well trodden. It wound through thickets and dips, animal tracks crisscrossing the terrain. Shadow moved with purpose, occasionally pausing to sniff or glance back. Logan followed in silence, his breath visible in the frozen air. Roughly a quarter-mile in, Shadow stopped beside a small rise where the snow formed an uneven mound. Logan approached slowly, recognizing the glint of something metallic beneath a cluster of snow-dusted branches. He knelt and brushed away the frost-covered debris. Wreckage. Twisted steel, part of a tail wing jagged and soot-stained. The snow had preserved its shape, hiding it like a grave marker. Next to it, nestled between two charred roots, was a small metal container about the size of a shoebox. Logan picked it up with stiff fingers. The latch was rusted, but it gave way with effort. Inside, maps. Not just standard aviation charts, but annotated ones. Flight paths, no-fly zones. Weather models. And tucked into the side, a folded report with military insignia faint but unmistakable. His chest tightened. These weren't from his most recent civilian flight. These were older, confidential, and they weren't his. A shout pulled him from his trance. "Logan!" It was Ellie, breathless, cheeks red from the cold, coat zipped haphazardly, her gloved hands gripping the strap of a small backpack. She must have followed them from the road. "What are you doing out here?" Logan asked, startled. "I saw you go and followed. I told Miss Grace, but she said Shadow would bark if something went wrong." She blinked up at him, then frowned. "What's that?" Logan hesitated, then showed her the box. "Old charts." "Not mine." Ellie tilted her head and pointed to his wrist. "You know, that bracelet. My dad had the same one." Logan glanced down. The braided paracord bracelet, green and black, worn thin with time. It had the faded initials WR stitched into the clasp. Ellie continued. "His name was Will Reed. He said only people in his squad got those. You were in the same one?" Logan nodded slowly, the realization settling like snow on his shoulders. "Yes. Will and I served together. He flew cover on my last tour." Ellie's eyes lit up for a second, then dimmed just as quickly. "He died when I was 6. They said it was his heart." "I didn't know," Logan said, voice softer now. "He was one of the best." She knelt beside the wreckage and brushed her fingers over the twisted metal. "Do you think it was really an accident?" she asked, eyes not leaving the steel. Logan looked down at the maps, the unusual notations, the silent question they raised. "No," he said finally. "I don't." They walked back slower than they'd come. Logan carried the box, his mind racing with what he had found, what it meant. Beside him, Ellie held Shadow's leash, speaking softly to the dog who responded with quiet, content tail wags. When they returned to the cabin, Grace was waiting, arms crossed again but not in suspicion. She looked at Logan first, then at the box, then at Ellie, whose face bore the shine of something larger than understanding. Grace nodded once. "You remember more." "Enough to know something was buried," Logan said, "and not just in snow." He set the box on the table, opened it for her to see, and as she leaned over it, Shadow curled beneath the window again, watchful, ready. Not every storm ended when the snow stopped falling. Some took years to thaw. The storm was gone now, but its echo lingered in the hush of the mountains. The snow had stopped falling 2 days ago, leaving behind a bright crust of ice that sparkled beneath the morning sun. The town of Whispering Pines stirred slowly back to life. Plows carved paths through white stillness, chimney smoke curled lazily into the pale sky, and the post office reopened with creaking doors and the smell of pine wood and ink. But for Grace and Logan, something deeper had thawed. The cabin behind the station house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional pop of wood in the stove. Logan stood by the dining table staring down at the maps he had recovered, now spread out and pinned at the corners with coffee mugs and salt shakers. His brow furrowed as he traced a faded line marked Echo Point, a location that hadn't been part of his authorized flight path. Grace leaned against the counter nearby, arms folded. She watched him silently for a while, then spoke in her low, steady voice. "You're holding back." Logan didn't deny it. He straightened, exhaled. "I wasn't just on a supply run. The company I flew for, Skyward Arrow, they've been contracting ex-military for private logistics, small classified payloads, often under the radar. I didn't ask too many questions until I started noticing anomalies in the nav data. Flight paths that rerouted midair. Altimeters giving false readings. Like someone wanted us off course." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sabotage?" He nodded. "I flagged it to command. Then, 3 days later, I was scheduled to transport a sealed container no manifest, no clearance. I confronted my ops director. Next thing I know, I'm assigned a solo flight during a blizzard, with a plane that failed in midair." She took a slow breath. "You think they wanted you to crash?" Logan's voice tightened. "I think they wanted silence. And I wasn't the first. I found a memo in one of the maps referring to 2 other pilots, both retired early after minor accidents." Grace stepped forward, picking up one of the folded papers. "You could take this to the FAA, the NTSB, hell, the press. They'd bury me. Or worse, use it to protect the company. They've got lawyers, shareholders, power." Grace was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "Then we go another way." Logan turned. "We?" "You're not in this alone anymore," she replied simply. "But if I report it, I need to leave your name out. No paper trail that traces back to you. You disappear from the official version." He hesitated, then nodded. "That's what I want." A short bark broke the tension. Shadow, who had been lying by the window, suddenly stood. His ears twitched and his tail moved, not alert this time, but excited. Grace walked to the door and opened it just as the mail carrier, a lean man in his 40s named Chuck Rayburn, stepped up to the porch. Chuck had sandy hair, a lopsided smile, and a way of moving like he was always trying not to slip on ice. "Mornin', Officer Morgan," he said cheerfully, handing her a small stack of mail. "Glad the roads are clearing up. Thought I'd drop this off myself." "Thanks, Chuck," Grace said, flipping through the letters. Most were bills. One was hand-addressed with a Montana return stamp. After Chuck left, Grace opened the envelope slowly, her fingers steady despite the rising curiosity. Inside was a folded note in shaky cursive on hospital stationery. To the officer who saved our daughter on Route 89. We never got your name. You pulled her from the wreck before the flames reached the gas tank. Doctors say she might walk again. We never got to say thank you. But every morning she says your name to the sky. The woman with the steady hands and the dog who didn't bark. You changed everything. The Hastings family, Bozeman, MT. Grace folded the letter slowly, a quiet stillness settling over her. She didn't speak, but Logan saw it, something fragile flickering behind her calm exterior. Not sadness, something close to belief. You never mentioned that, he said gently. I don't keep score, she replied. Sometimes you do what's needed and move on. Shadow nudged her leg softly as if agreeing. Later that afternoon, Grace sent a discreet report to a contact she trusted in Helena, an old academy friend now working for the State Transportation Safety Board. She included flight path anomalies, photographs of the wreckage, and images of the recovered maps and memos, everything except Logan's name. Meanwhile, Logan and Shadow worked quietly in the back shed. Logan had started reconstructing the digital data from the salvaged nav module he'd smuggled out of the wreckage, while Shadow stood guard at the doorway like a silent partner. The dog was no longer just a protector. He followed Logan now, not out of suspicion, but solidarity. When Logan moved, Shadow moved with him. When he stopped, Shadow sat like a statue carved from loyalty. Grace watched them through the kitchen window, arms resting on the frame, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had seen many partnerships in her career between officers, between siblings, even between broken people and broken animals. But the one forming now between Logan and Shadow carried something different, something earned. That night, Logan sat beside the fire with the maps laid out once more. Grace handed him a mug of cocoa-nut coffee this time, and he accepted it with a nod. Shadow curled between them, his breathing deep and even. You think it'll work? Logan asked. Grace stared into the flames. It has to. Outside, the snow glowed silver under a half moon, and in the quiet hum of warmth and firelight, 3 figures sat together, not as strangers, not as broken things, but as people rebuilding something neither had expected to find again. The sky above whispering pines had changed. Days of biting wind and relentless snowfall had finally given way to a stillness that almost felt like permission. The clouds had softened into gray wool, sunlight peeking through in careful slivers. Beneath the waning drifts, the town breathed again. Roads reappeared, trails carved out by boot prints and sled runners, and the pine trees stood tall, their branches no longer bowed under snow, but reaching toward the sun with quiet resilience. Behind the station house, the small open field had become a makeshift airstrip. Nothing official, just enough space cleared of snow for a single landing and takeoff. There, at the edge of the trees, sat the battered old bush plane, silver and blue beneath the white sky, its fuselage patched with salvaged metal and old skill. It looked like a bird that had once crashed but refused to stay grounded. Logan stood beside it, tightening the bolts on a newly fitted wing. He had regained color in his cheeks, and though his movements were still careful, the pain had settled into something manageable. He was different now, more present. There was a steadiness in the way he moved, a quiet assurance in how he handled the tools passed to him by the locals who came to help, one by one. Tom Grady, the town's only mechanic, had brought over his rolling toolbox. In his 60s, with oil-stained fingers and a beard that had gone silver long before retirement, Tom rarely spoke unless spoken to. But when he saw the wing damage, he gave a low grunt and said, "I've seen worse. You got half a shot if you reinforce the flap hinges." Then he got to work like the plane had been his all along. Annie Morales, the town librarian, short, sharp, and always with a pencil stuck behind her ear, had brought an old aviation manual from her grandfather's collection and offered it with the words, "I trust people who crash less than once." And then there was Ellie. She came every afternoon after school, her red coat flapping behind her like a cape, cheeks pink from the cold. Today, she held a wooden box in her mittened hands, decorated with stars and rough blue paint. Shadow trotted beside her, tongue out, tail high. They were, by now, an inseparable duo, girl and dog, heart and muscle. Logan looked up as she approached. "What have you got there, pilot?" "It's for you." She beamed, lifting the lid. Inside was a model airplane, made from popsicle sticks and glue, with carefully carved wings and a tail. Painted on each wing was a small, simple image, 2 green pine branches crossed with white wings rising from their center. "I made it with Shadow," she said proudly. "He picked the paint colors." Logan knelt, visibly moved. "That's the best flight crew I've ever had." Grace appeared beside him, smiling. She wore a dark parka, her badge tucked beneath a wool scarf, her gloved hands folded across her chest. "The symbol," she said, nodding at the model. Ellie thought of it. Wings wrapped around the trees. A place to fall. And rise again. Logan turned the model in his hands, his throat tightening. "It's perfect." The test flight was scheduled for the next clear morning. By dawn, half the town had gathered at the edge of the field. They stood bundled in coats and scarves, boots crunching on the frost, hands around steaming cups of coffee. No one said much. They didn't need to. They all knew who Logan was, even if the newspaper never named him. From the back porch of the station house, Grace watched silently, Shadow seated at her heel. Ellie stood beside them, arms wrapped around her middle, a nervous bounce in her feet. Grace had braided her hair that morning, something she hadn't done in years, but Ellie had asked, and Grace hadn't known how to say no. Logan approached the plane, wearing a leather bomber jacket that had clearly seen better days. Pinned to his chest was a small patch hand-stitched by Ellie from her mother's old sewing kit. The same symbol, pine wings. He looked over at Grace, met her eyes. She gave a single nod. No words, he climbed in. The engine sputtered at first, coughed once, then roared to life. It sounded rough but alive. People stepped back as the propeller spun faster, the sound growing into a steady, determined rhythm. Logan's silhouette could be seen through the frost-dusted window, focused, calm. Then the plane moved. The wheels bumped along the snow-packed strip, picking up speed, gaining lift. And then it rose. Not high, not fast. Just enough to clear the trees and circle wide above the field. The crowd below held their breath, gazes tilted skyward, hearts quiet. From above, Logan saw it all. The cabin, the town, the curved white slopes beyond. The people, the dog, the girl. And for the first time since the crash, he wasn't falling. He was flying. He circled once, twice, then brought the plane down, the landing clean and slow. As the wheels kissed the earth again, a cheer broke out, small but genuine, the sound of something fragile being held up by many hands. Later that day, the Whispering Pines Gazette published a feature story titled "The Stranger and the Shepherd Who Saved the Broken Wing." The article was unsigned and no names were mentioned, but everyone in town knew. They'd seen the plane. They'd seen the people. They'd seen the change. Grace clipped the article and pinned it inside her office. Just beside it, Ellie placed the model plane. And Shadow, ever faithful, curled beside them, watching with the calm certainty of someone who had always known exactly where the wind would carry them. The air in Whispering Pines had shifted again. Spring hadn't arrived, but winter had begun to loosen its grip enough for the river to crack its ice, enough for the pines to weep a little sap. In town, snow melted into muddy slush along the sidewalks, and the sun hung longer in the sky, casting gold instead of gray. The wind still carried a chill, but it no longer bit. It nudged. At the cabin behind the station house, Grace stood in the doorway, one hand on her hip, the other clutching a faded photograph Ellie had drawn, a plane soaring above trees, a dog howling joyfully below, a stick-figure pilot waving from the cockpit. The caption, scribbled in shaky block letters, read, "Don't forget where you landed." It had been 8 days since Logan left. He hadn't said much before he went, but the night before his departure, he stood in the doorway with the firelight behind him and pressed a small silver object into her hand, a pilot's insignia, worn, edges dulled by time and touch. "I lost it once," he said, voice low. "Didn't think it meant anything anymore. But it brought me here. Maybe it'll help me find my way back." Grace didn't speak, only closed her fingers around it and gave a small nod. "And if there's still space in this life you've built," he added, glancing toward the porch where Shadow lay curled, "I'd like to come back. You know, if the dog lets me." Then he was gone boarding a charter flight to Helena, where a hearing awaited him. He was due to testify before the Transportation Safety Commission, finally bringing to light the tampered flight logs, sabotage, and illegal cargo operations that had nearly cost him and others their lives. This time he wasn't running. He was standing up. In the days that followed, Grace didn't speak much about him. But Ellie asked nearly every day. And Shadow. Shadow waited. The dog had taken to sitting on the porch every evening at dusk, just before the sun dipped below the treetops. He'd rest his chin on the wooden railing, ears perked toward the distant hills, body still as a statue carved from devotion. It was the same spot he had stood that first night when Logan lay unconscious on the couch inside. And now he returned to it, as if watching the sky might bring the man back. "Do you think he'll really come back?" Ellie had asked one afternoon, her breath fogging as she pressed her cheek against Shadow's fur. Grace had answered honestly, "I don't know, but I think he wants to." On the 9th day, something changed. It was late afternoon, the light warm and soft, the trees casting long shadows across the field. Grace sat on the porch steps, polishing the scratched surface of the pilot's insignia, its silver wings catching the fading sun. Ellie had gone home for dinner. Shadow lay nearby, not asleep, just waiting. Then it came, the distant rumble. Not thunder, not wind. A sound Grace had learned to know by heart, the thrum of a small aircraft engine. She stood instantly. Shadow lifted his head, ears rising. The plane dipped low, skimming just above the ridge before leveling over the clearing behind the station house. Its markings were familiar silver and blue, with the patchwork tail he and Tom had rebuilt together. Grace felt her heart quicken, though her face stayed calm. The plane circled once, then landed softly in the field, tires crunching over the thawed snow. As the propeller slowed, the door opened. Logan stepped out, wearing the same leather jacket, his boots dusted with road grime, his duffel slung over one shoulder. He looked tired but whole, lighter somehow. He stopped a few steps from the porch and looked up. "Did I miss dinner?" he asked. Grace said nothing at first. Then, with the faintest of smiles, "Only by 9 days." Shadow moved first. The dog trotted down the steps and straight to Logan, tail wagging not wildly, but rhythmically, purposefully, as if confirming something. Logan knelt, hand resting on Shadow's head, and exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath since the day he left. "I kept my word," he murmured. Grace stepped down the porch steps and stopped a few feet away. "Was it bad?" she asked quietly. He stood straighter, the duffel slipping from his shoulder. "Harder than I expected. But it's done. The commission heard everything. I handed over the flight data, the maps, even the maintenance records I managed to recover. And I wasn't the only one. 2 other pilots came forward. Turns out the sabotage ran deeper than I thought." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sabotage?" Logan nodded. His voice darkened. Skyward Arrow wasn't just sloppy, they were dangerous. They altered navigation systems mid-flight, redirected pilots into restricted or weather-heavy zones, and falsified maintenance records to keep faulty planes flying. They used ex-military pilots like me because we didn't ask too many questions. He paused, jaw tightening. "The last flight, I was ordered to transport a sealed container. No manifest, no destination disclosure. Just coordinates and a time window during a snowstorm. When I pushed back, questioned it, they called it a loyalty test." "And then your system failed," Grace finished quietly. "They tampered with the GPS-fed false readings. Sent me off course by design. The plane wasn't just malfunctioning, it was a setup. A calculated crash. If I hadn't bailed when I did, if Shadow hadn't found me—" He stopped, looking out at the clearing where the plane had once rested. Grace's voice was tight but steady. Why go that far? To keep the secret buried. They were smuggling high-value tech prototypes, military-grade sensors, maybe worse through private airspace. If anyone connected the dots, the company's entire operation would collapse. I became a liability the moment I asked questions. Her fingers closed around the insignia. And now, Skyward Aero is under full federal investigation. Their CEO resigned yesterday. Half their fleet's grounded. My testimony wasn't the only nail, but it hit hard. Grace looked at him for a long moment, then down at Shadow, who had walked up and stood silently beside Logan, like a verdict made flesh. "No more hiding," Logan said softly. "Not for me. Not for what they did." She crossed her arms. "You came back." "I told you I would," he said, "if there was still room." Shadow looked between them and gave a short bark. Grace arched an eyebrow. "Well, you'll have to negotiate with the dog. He's got seniority." Logan laughed, a sound rough with relief. "I'll take my chances." As twilight deepened, they walked back toward the porch together. No fanfare, no promises. Just the quiet ease of people who had found something they didn't know they needed and refused to lose it again. Behind them, the wind stirred through the trees like the rustle of feathers. And above, in the softening sky, a single hawk glided low, its wings brushing the edge of the pines. The air over Whispering Pines smelled of pine sap and new beginnings. Spring had finally breached the stubborn walls of winter. The snow was mostly gone, receding like a memory, and the trees stood tall again, their needles glinting in the sun. In the meadow near the tree line, where once a damaged plane had rested like a broken bird, people gathered under an open sky. It wasn't a grand occasion. No stage, no microphones, no government vans or cameras. Just folding chairs arranged in a circle, an arch of wildflowers tied with twine, and an old wooden sign someone had painted by hand that read, "Welcome home, Captain." Logan Pierce stood in the clearing, shoulders squared, his uniform jacket crisp and newly pressed military blue, reinstated and restored. The silver wings pinned to his chest were not just returned, but re-earned. He looked older than the last time he wore them lines around the eyes, the kind that came from both war and healing. But he looked lighter too, like a man who had been cracked open and filled again with something real. Beside him stood Grace Morgan, in civilian clothes for once. Dark jeans, a forest green flannel, and her old patrol boots still dusted with dried mud. Her badge wasn't pinned to her belt, but it didn't need to be. The way the town watched her, some with admiration, some with quiet gratitude, spoke volumes more. Shadow sat between them, tongue out, chest high, ears twitching at the distant birdsong. A black and tan German shepherd, age 7, eyes gold and knowing. His coat had been brushed until it gleamed, and around his neck was a new collar navy blue with gold stitching. Whispering Pines. K9. Honorary. The mayor of Whispering Pines, a wiry woman named Harriet Coleshort Silver Bob, round glasses, voice like dry leaves, stepped forward with a clipboard in one hand and a small wooden plaque in the other. "I won't make this long," she began, eyes scanning the small crowd of maybe 40 townsfolk. "Because truth doesn't need ceremony, and everyone here already knows it. But sometimes it's important to say things aloud, especially when it involves a man who fell from the sky, a dog who refused to look away, and a woman who opened her door when the storm didn't." There were a few chuckles, some soft murmurs. Harriet turned toward Logan. "Captain Logan Pierce, by order of the state of Montana, and in recognition of the findings from the Federal Transportation Commission, you are hereby reinstated with full honor and flight certification. You are also, by informal yet unanimous vote from Whispering Pines, granted honorary citizenship status." She handed him the plaque. "And no, that doesn't exempt you from library late fees." The crowd laughed gently, and Logan accepted the plaque with quiet hands and glassy eyes. Then Harriet turned toward Shadow. "And to this four-legged officer," she said, her voice softening. Though retired, he chose not to rest. He found a man in the snow, kept watch through the night, and guided our town towards something it had forgotten courage. We officially recognize Shadow as Whispering Pine's honorary K9. And no one better ever try to steal his porch spot. Grace knelt beside Shadow and fastened a polished medallion onto his new collar. It glinted in the sun, an engraving of wings curled around a pine tree. Ellie ran forward then, her boots thudding lightly across the grass. She was holding something wrapped in cloth, both hands careful. Her cheeks were rosy, eyes bright. "I made you a new one," she said, placing it in Logan's hands. He unfolded the cloth to reveal a new model airplane smaller than the last, more detailed. But this time, there were 3 carved figures seated on the tiny wings: a pilot, a policewoman, and a German shepherd. Painted in childlike strokes across the fuselage were the words, "The Flying Family." Logan knelt and met her eyes. "It's perfect." "I even added little goggles to Shadow," she whispered. A newspaper reporter stood at the edge of the gathering, observing quietly. His name was Clive Harper, late 40s, round-shouldered, always carried a notebook with corners curled. He wasn't from Whispering Pines, but he'd followed Logan's story since it first surfaced. That afternoon, he scribbled a headline into his pad before packing it away: "The Man Who Fell to Find a Home." The crowd slowly dispersed into laughter, picnic blankets, and clinking jars of lemonade. Music played faintly from a battery speaker, an old bluegrass tune that sounded like it belonged in the trees. Someone brought cornbread. Someone else passed around peach pie. Grace and Logan sat at the edge of the meadow, legs stretched toward the sun. Shadow lay between them, snoring softly with one ear still tuned to the wind. "You think it's over?" Grace asked, eyes still on the horizon. Logan shook his head. "No, but it's not a secret anymore. And I think that's enough." Grace leaned her shoulder against his. "Stay this time?" she asked. Logan's hand found hers, fingers intertwining easily. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "This is where I landed." Above them, the sky was wide and blue and full of birds. A kite soared from the hands of a boy at the far end of the field, spinning lazily in the wind. Ellie clapped from a distance, shouting, "It's flying! Look, it's really flying." Grace looked at Logan. "So are we. We don't choose where our story begins. Sometimes it starts in the wreckage, in the snow, in the silence after everything falls apart. But we do get to choose who walks beside us when we begin again." For Logan, it wasn't just the kindness of a quiet officer or the innocence of a little girl. It was the unwavering gaze of a dog who refused to leave. Shadow didn't just lead him out of the forest. He led him home. That German shepherd wasn't just a guardian. He was memory. He was hope. He was the bridge between a man's past and the life he never knew he needed. And maybe that's what we all need. Someone to sit beside us on the porch when the sky darkens. Someone who sees us when we're lost and chooses to stay anyway. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave us a comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story that might bring light to your day. And may God bless you wherever you are, whoever you've lost, and whoever you're still walking home with.
A soldier came home and found his German shepherd starving in his backyard. What he did next inspired millions. The air was colder than Logan Carter remembered. He stepped off the long-haul bus just as dusk settled over the small Texas town he once called home. His duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a single rolling suitcase behind him, he made his way on foot toward the old family house tucked at the edge of the neighborhood. Each step felt surreal. 13 months in Syria. The chaos, the sand, the silence after explosions, it all felt farther away than the familiar cracked sidewalks now beneath his boots. When he reached the backyard gate, something in his chest shifted. The house stood in eerie stillness. The porch light was off. Grass had overtaken the garden beds. Weeds reached up through the broken fence panels. The back door was shut tight, its rusted hinges sealed with time. "Mom? Dad?" he called out, his voice low, uncertain. No response. He circled to the side door, the one that always stuck in the summer. It creaked open without resistance now. Inside, everything was still. The living room sat untouched. Dust coated the couch cushions. Picture frames leaned at odd angles. A thin film covered the kitchen table. Plates were gone from the cabinets, drawers half open, as if left in a rush. Logan's chest tightened. He had no idea that during his deployment, his parents had lost the house due to financial strain and quietly moved out months ago. Letters had gone unanswered. Calls dropped. And now he was home, but the home was empty. He dropped his bag by the door and stepped out into the backyard. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sharp chill and a silence that seemed unnatural. Then, just as he turned to leave, he heard it. A scratch, faint, then a low, broken whimper. He froze. The sound came from the corner of the yard, the old wooden kennel, half collapsed from neglect. He approached slowly, pulling out the flashlight from his backpack, its beams slicing through the darkness. Then he saw it. In the farthest corner of the kennel, a dog lay curled against the splintered boards. Its body was skeletal, fur in patches, skin clinging to bone. The dog trembled with each shallow breath. One of its hind legs was twisted unnaturally. Its eyes, pale and filmy, locked onto his. Logan's first instinct was to turn away. It looked feral, nearly dead, but then the flashlight caught something on its neck. A collar, rusted and cracked, with one word barely visible beneath the grime. Axel. The world seemed to stop. Axel. The German shepherd he had raised from a pup. The dog he had trained, loved and whispered to before deployment, promising, "I'll come back for you." A neighbor had offered to care for him. Logan had believed him. Now that same dog lay dying in the dirt, forgotten by everyone except Logan. He dropped to his knees. "Axel! Oh, God!" The dog stirred. Slowly, painfully, Axel dragged himself forward an inch, then another, until his snout touched the toe of Logan's boot. He pressed his head against it and gave a single, weak wag of his tail before collapsing. Tears filled Logan's eyes, blurring the light as he reached out and gathered Axel into his arms. The dog was light, far too light. His breath was shallow, heartbeat faint. Logan stood, holding Axel close to his chest, his voice cracking through clenched teeth. "I left you, and you waited for me. You waited all this time." He ran through the yard, through the dark street beyond, tears streaming down his face, dialing emergency numbers with shaking hands, carrying a dog who never stopped believing he would come home. The fluorescent lights in the emergency veterinary clinic buzzed faintly overhead as Logan stood in the corner, arms crossed tightly, staring through the glass window into the operating room. Axel lay on a metal table surrounded by a team of professionals, moving with urgent precision. One of the vets, a woman with tired eyes and gentle hands, stepped into the hallway to speak with Logan. "He has less than 24 hours unless we act now," she said. "Severe malnutrition, dehydration, organ stress, infection. We can try, but it won't be cheap, and there are no guarantees." Logan did not hesitate. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his military ID and bank card, and signed the consent form with a firm stroke. Every cent he had saved from his last tour, meant for a truck or a new start, would now go towards saving the only soul that had waited for him. Back at the house, the silence was deafening. Logan left the lights off, lit a single lamp in the living room and started cleaning. He scrubbed the floors, vacuumed dust from the furniture, washed windows streaked with grime. It was nearly dawn when he stopped. In the middle of the room, he laid down a thick blanket, folded towels, and an old pillow. It would be Axel's bed. He filled a stainless steel bowl with cold water and set it beside a second one. In the kitchen, he defrosted beef, chopped carrots and rice, and simmered everything slowly into a stew. Every movement was deliberate, quiet, heavy with guilt and hope. The next evening, the clinic called. Axel had made it through surgery. They brought him home wrapped in a thermal blanket, an IV port still taped to his front leg, a small shaved patch over a stitched wound. He could not walk. He barely lifted his head, but he was alive. Logan laid Axel on the prepared bedding and knelt beside him. "We're here now," he whispered. "This is home again." Each day was a test of patience and endurance. Logan set alarms to feed Axel every 4 hours, measured his water intake, kept a journal of his recovery. He sat with him for hours, speaking softly, playing quiet classical music to drown out the emptiness. When Axel trembled, Logan opened the windows to let sunlight warm the space. He learned how to gently massage Axel's muscles, encouraging blood flow. Every time Axel lifted his head, Logan celebrated like a victory. Then came the night Logan's past broke through. It started like it always did, in the quiet. A memory, a sound, a flash. Logan bolted upright from the couch, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as he gasped for air. His chest felt tight, vision blurred, hands clawing at his shirt. And then, movement. Axel, dragging his weak body across the floor, pulled himself into the room. Logan barely noticed until he felt a gentle nudge against his chest. The dog rested his head there, his breath slow and steady. A low whine vibrated through his throat, grounding Logan in the moment, anchoring him in something real. Logan wrapped his arms around Axel, pulled him in close, forehead pressed to fur. "I came back for you," he whispered, voice cracking, "but maybe you came back for me too." The room fell still again, but this time it was not empty. The days grew longer, and so did Axel's strength. With each passing morning, he seemed to reclaim a little more of the life he had nearly lost. What started as weak attempts to lift his head turned into dragging himself to the food bowl, and eventually, one crisp morning, he stood, shaky, unsteady, but on all fours. Logan watched with wide eyes, frozen in place, afraid that if he moved, the moment would vanish. Axel took one slow step, then another, then collapsed into the blanket. But he wagged his tail, just once, and that was enough to bring tears to Logan's eyes. Recovery was not just Axel's journey, it was Logan's too. Since coming home, he had been relying on sleeping pills and occasional numbing habits to dull the constant hum of past trauma. But with Axel now needing him fully, Logan stopped taking the pills. He replaced the restless nights with walks in the yard, feeding schedules, and new purpose. He began preparing real meals, eating with Axel by his side. By the 3rd week, he started waking up early to stretch, to move, to breathe beside his dog. They trained together, Axel learning to walk again, Logan learning how to live again. Their days found rhythm. Morning walks as the fog lifted from the grass, evenings spent side by side on the porch steps, bathed in orange light, the wind brushing gently past them. Neither spoke, of course, but the silence was no longer something to fear. It was shared. One evening, Logan snapped a photo, Axel's head resting on his knee, the sun painting them gold. On a whim, he logged into the old Facebook group for military veterans, a place he had not visited since deployment. He uploaded the photo and wrote, "He waited for me. I don't know how, but he did, and somehow he's helping me come back too." He almost did not hit post, but he did, and the response was like a tidal wave. Within hours, the post had hundreds of likes. Comments poured in. Fellow soldiers shared their stories, their dogs, their pain. Messages came from strangers, from widows of veterans, from former medics and nurses who remembered soldiers like Logan. They thanked him. They thanked Axel. Then came a private message. A short one. "I was going to end my life tonight. Then I read your story. Your dog saved more than you think." Logan read the message 3 times, staring at the screen in stunned silence. His hands trembled, not from fear but from something else, something deeper. He blinked, swallowed, and leaned back in his chair. Axel, sensing the shift in energy, got up slowly and padded over. He climbed gently into Logan's lap, still too big for it, and laid his head squarely on Logan's chest. Logan wrapped his arms around the dog, holding him close. His eyes burned, but he let the tears fall, not out of grief this time, but out of something unfamiliar, something healing. He pressed his cheek into Axel's fur and whispered, "We're doing it, buddy. We're actually doing it." And in that golden silence, man and dog sat together, two souls who had once been lost, now leading others home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as Logan and Axel strolled along the winding path. It had become part of their new routine, an hour outside every day, surrounded by the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, and the normalcy that Logan once thought he would never feel again. Axel walked proudly by his side, still bearing a slight limp, but moving with strength and purpose that defied the memory of the frail dog Logan had found just weeks ago. They neared the playground where families gathered, toddlers ran through the grass, and the air was filled with squeals of joy. Logan smiled faintly. Axel's ears twitched at the sound of children, his tail swaying gently behind him. Then it happened. A loud shout pierced the calm, followed by a flurry of motion. A large dog, muscular, wild-eyed, its leash trailing behind, had broken free from its owner and was barreling toward a little girl standing alone near the edge of the play area. She froze, eyes wide, unable to scream. Chaos erupted. Parents shouted. People ran. Logan turned instinctively, his eyes locking on the incoming danger. He opened his mouth to call out, but before a word left his lips, Axel moved, like a switch had been flipped inside him. Axel surged forward, body low, fast, every ounce of his training and protective instinct igniting all at once. Logan yelled his name, but Axel was already a blur across the grass. He reached the girl just as the other dog lunged. Axel threw himself into its path, intercepting the attack mid-air. The two animals collided with a vicious snarl. Axel growled, bit, clawed, locked onto the dog's scruff and held it back with all the strength his wounded body could muster. Logan sprinted forward, heart pounding in his chest. By the time he reached them, Axel was still holding the other dog down, blood staining the fur around his neck and shoulder. The little girl was crying but untouched, scooped into her mother's arms and pulled to safety. Logan dove between the snarling chaos, gripping Axel's collar, shouting for help. Other adults joined in, pulling the aggressive dog away. It took several minutes to separate them. When it was over, the ground was torn, grass ripped, blood soaked into the dirt. Axel lay panting, his body trembling, his ear torn, and one leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. "No, no, no." Logan dropped to his knees, cradling Axel's battered body in his arms. Blood smeared his hands, his shirt, but he did not care. "You're okay, buddy. Stay with me. You did good. You did so good." Axel blinked slowly, his chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. The sound of sirens approached in the distance. Someone had called animal emergency. Logan pressed his face into Axel's fur, his voice breaking. "You saved her, like you saved me," he whispered, tears falling freely onto the dog's blood-matted coat. Axel did not respond, but his tail twitched once, just once, against Logan's arm before going still. And in that moment, surrounded by chaos, sirens, and strangers, Logan held the dog who had once waited for him through war and time and who had just given everything to protect again. The video was shaky, taken by a bystander's phone, but it captured everything: the frantic screams, the charging dog, Axel's leap, and the moment he threw himself between a terrified little girl and danger. It captured blood, chaos, and a soldier's trembling hands cradling his injured companion. Within hours, the clip went viral. The media called it the Backyard Guardian story. News stations ran the footage on every major network. Headlines read, "Neglected dog becomes hero. Veteran's dog saves child. From forgotten to fearless." Within days, Logan and Axel's faces were on every screen in America. The world wanted to know more, not about a soldier or a war, but about the bond that had survived both. Interviews poured in, morning shows, veteran organizations, animal rescue groups. Logan kept his answers simple, heartfelt. He never tried to make himself the hero. "I didn't rescue Axel," he said over and over. "He rescued everything I had left." He told the story of how he found Axel in the backyard, starving and silent, how he almost walked away, how that broken dog brought him back to life, piece by piece. Every time he spoke, he looked at Axel with the same gratitude in his eyes, a look that needed no translation. Then came the invitation from the American Hero Dog Awards. They wanted to honor Axel with the highest national recognition for service animals, Hero Dog of the Year. The ceremony would be held in New York City. Logan hesitated, unsure if Axel could travel, unsure if he even wanted the attention. But when he asked Axel, softly, as if the dog could decide, Axel thumped his tail and nudged Logan's hand, as if to say, "We've come this far, let's go the rest of the way." The night of the ceremony, the theater was full, hundreds of guests, bright lights, music, and emotion in the air. When Axel's name was announced, the room erupted in applause. He stepped onto the stage beside Logan, his gait uneven but proud, the light catching the healed scar along his shoulder like a badge of honor. People stood. Applause turned to cheers. Some wiped away tears. Logan adjusted the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "He was forgotten in the backyard," Logan began, his voice clear. "But he never gave up on me. He waited. He forgave. And when it mattered most, he gave again. That is what love looks like. That is what loyalty truly means." There was no sound in the room for a beat, then a thunderous standing ovation. Later that night, far from the stage and cameras, Logan and Axel returned home. The house was still quiet, still familiar. They walked out to the porch as the sky burned with sunset. Axel laid down slowly, resting his head on Logan's boot, breathing deep and steady. Logan reached down and stroked his head. No words were spoken. None were needed. The final light of day stretched across the yard, casting two shadows side by side, one man, one dog, watching the world they had saved and been saved by. On the screen, in silent text, the words appeared, "They were never just a soldier and a dog. They were the parts of each other that war couldn't take." Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. A story of loyalty, survival, redemption, and the unshakable bond between a soldier and his best friend. Axel was more than a dog. He was hope with four legs. A quiet hero who waited through silence and rose when it mattered most. If this story touched your heart, made you smile, cry, or believe in second chances again, we invite you to be part of something bigger. Subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories for more true, emotional tales of animals who save us in ways we never see coming. Give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment to tell us how Axel's journey moved you, and don't forget to share it with someone who could use a reminder that love, loyalty, and healing often come with paws. Because here at Amazing Paws Stories, every paw has a purpose, and every story has the power to inspire millions. We'll see you in the next one.